So our first speaker is going to be Jorn Herner, and Jorn is currently the chief of the California Resources Board Planning, Administration, and Emissions Mitigation Branch. And I should say I've known Jorn for quite a few years. When he was a graduate student, I knew him, and he's been there, and we've had some interactions, and he's been very active in looking about where fuels and the mitigation plans for the state of California. And so with that, I'm going to invite Jorn up, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Jamie. What a pleasure to be here, and what a great set of talks we had this morning. So I'll be talking about the role of biofuels in the California's climate program. I'll talk about our climate program broadly, and I wanted to make the point that the reason we have interest in biofuels is, of course, because they're low carbon, not because they're biosourced, but we're trying to get carbon out of transportation and other liquid fuels. So an overview of my talk. I'm going to talk first about the California Climate Program broadly, the goals we have set out for ourselves, the planning that we're doing to try to meet those goals, and then something about the specific programs that we put in place to start bending the trajectory towards meeting those goals. Specifically, I'll talk about our low carbon fuel standard. That's one place where one regulation that's bringing in a lot of biofuels to our system. The alternative diesel fuels regulation, which was just passed, which puts in place a mechanism that allows new types of diesel fuels that have low carbon intensities to enter our markets. Research, what we're doing to inform the process as we change how we live and play towards a lower carbon intensity mode, and then next steps. So first, I wanted to start with broad climate goals, and we just heard from two lawyers that there's a difference between a good piece of legislation and something that happens from the executive branch. And we have both legislation and directives from our from our governor in form of executive orders on what to implement. For 2020, we have a broad goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels and to increase the amount of electricity we get from renewable sources to 33%. Those are legislatively mandated. And then we have an executive order that requires us to reduce the carbon intensity, CI, I couldn't fit in carbon intensity there, of our fuels by 10%. And then for a long time, or even early on, we also had the 2050 goal here as an executive order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 1990. And those 2020 goals and the 2050 goals served us fine for a long time. But it became clear that there was a long swath of time between 2020 and 2050, and we needed some milestones in between. So over just the last year, actually, we've gotten all these 2030 targets that we're now starting to aim and plan for. The first one is to increase our electricity generation to be 50% from renewables and to double our building energy efficiency standards. Those are legislatively mandated, so went through our legislature. And then executive orders were promulgated to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and to reduce fossil fuels in transportation by 50%. So these create good milestones at a reasonable amount of time out from our 2020 goals to where we can start planning for it and putting in place regulations and programs to meet them. The two executive orders for 2030, they were part of bills in our legislature this year. They did not make it through the entire process, but I expect that the legislature will take up those topics again in the next session. So those may become legislation rather than executive orders. So I want to start by taking a look at the overall energy usage in California and where that energy comes from. Turns out that we use just above 7,000 trillion BTUs equivalent every year. And the quality of life that we all enjoy and that other people want to enjoy is really dependent on the amount of energy that we use. And that was referred to in the last session as well. I don't want to live in an energy-starved environment either. We're able to move around, have refrigeration, have the lights on, et cetera. I just don't want my energy to come from fossil fuels. Right now, we're generating about 25% of the electricity in California from renewables. And for the purpose of this talks, the gasoline and diesel that we use mostly in our cars and trucks are, of course, from fossil fuels. And that's where biofuels might come in and lend a hand. So in 2013, the California Coalition of Sustainable Transportation put together a very comprehensive study on the potential for developing biofuels in the state of California. And they took a look at all different sources of feedstocks and whatnot that we have in California, and suggest that by 2050, if we continue on the path that we're on right now, we can have about, I think that's 600 trillion BTUs equivalent of liquid fuels that we can use for cars and trucks, or in an optimistic scenario, quite a bit more than that. And you'll see, I mean, this is a fair fraction of what we're already using. So that's actually a pretty positive outlook on where we're headed, and the ability of biofuels, low carbon fuels, to meet a fair amount of our needs for liquid fuels in things like trucks and other places. So how are we going to do this? Well, the state has issued a number of different plans and vision document that tries to lay out how we're going to meet those broad goals for 2020 and 2030 and well, we haven't gotten to planning for 2050 yet, but most important is our climate change scoping plan. That's legislatively demanded that we need to come out with a scoping plan and update it every 5 years. We released one in 2014. Well, we released the first one in 2008 that laid out how we're going to get to 2020. Then we released one in 2014 that showed that the programs we put in place have more or less put us on the path to meet the 2020 goals. And we will be updating this now that we have all those 2030 goals that we didn't have before. We'll be updating the scoping plan in 2016 to lay the path for how we're going to meet the goals of 2030. We have our Safeguarding California guidelines that shows how the state will deal with the impact of climate change that's already in the pipeline, so to say. Then we have specific strategies for mobile sources and sustainable freight. And then we just released a concept paper for how to deal with short-lived climate pollutants. And it lays out goals of reducing methane and hydrofluorocarbons by 40% from today by 2030, and black carbon by 50%. So we have a number of different programs, specific programs that are already in place to meet these various targets. There's a lot of individual regulations and whatnot. These are kind of the 4 top-tier programs that we have, so I wanted to mention them. The first is the Advanced Clean Cars that was referred to earlier as well. It says CO2 tailpipe emissions from our light-duty vehicles. It concerns model years 2017 through 25. We will most certainly need to continue that and ratchet that down post-2025, but we don't have any legislation or regulations on that yet. That's going to be coming over the next 5 years. We have our cap and trade program, which caps CO2 and require that you purchase permits for all CO2 emissions that you have in the state. And we're slowly bringing more and more parts of the economy into our cap and trade program. Importantly, fuels for transportation were included as of 2015. We have our renewable portfolio standard that was discussed earlier. And then for another important one that's, of course, of interest to this audience on biofuels is our low carbon fuel standard, which requires to reduce the carbon intensity of our transportation fuel by 10% by 2020. So let's talk about that rule a little bit more. So I'm hoping that's visible. So that is the rule the way it was initially conceptualized in 2010. That's the compliance curve you see there, and the reduction in carbon intensity of the fuels that was required. Here is what has actually happened. Not surprisingly, we were sued in 2013 about the rule. The judge put a stay on the rule saying you can keep the program in place at the current level of carbon intensity, but you can't continue to ratchet it down until the case has been finished. So we finally finished the case in 2015, and now we're able to continue with the program. Here is what has actually happened. Here are the carbon intensities of the fuels that we have in California right now, and you can see that the difference between the black line up here and the green line up here are credits that are building up in our system. And now that the court case is over, we need a new compliance line. So here's the new compliance line. You can see from 2011 to 2015, we reduced the carbon intensity requirement by 1%. And over the next 5 years, we're going to go the next 9%. So things are going to get interesting as we really start to ratchet down the requirements on the carbon intensity of our fuels. Where have the credits come from in the last 5 years? Here they are by proportion. The big blue line here is from ethanol. Initially, most of the carbon credits that were applied for and got through the program was through ethanol, corn ethanol from the Midwest. But more and more we're seeing diesel, both biodiesel and renewable diesel production and coming into our market. And that's actually quite welcoming. It's easier to convert light-duty vehicles to electric and get away from liquid fuels. It's more difficult with diesel. So it's a positive development that low-carbon diesel is entering the market. And then this line is a cumulative amount of credits that build up in the system, plotted on the secondary y-axis. There's about 5 million metric tons equivalent already built up. The goal of the program is to reduce CO2 emission by 16 million metric tons per year by 2020. So how are we going to meet that? Various modeling suggests different pathways. Here's one possible pathway that we think is a possibility for how we can meet these reductions in the carbon intensity of our fuels. You can see biodiesel and ethanol are still important, but electricity is also now starting to become a part of the mix. And hydrogen, that we do see that as a future fuel, but it's still not generating a lot of credits through this program. And how do we determine the carbon intensity of the various fuels that we have here? It's a full life cycle analysis that's done. It's done every 3 years, and they can be updated. We just updated them actually, and you can see that the secondary indirect land use chain charge to some of these different fuels has gone down quite a bit since the last cycle. And things like the North American natural gas has gone up as we learn more about the associated methane emissions associated with extracting those fuels. I also wanted to talk about the alternative diesel fuel regulation that was passed by our board just last month. It concerns any fuel used in a diesel engine that's not petroleum-based and that's not solely hydrocarbons. So renewable diesel, for example, is all hydrocarbons. It's just normal, regular diesel. We don't expect adverse emissions effect from it, so it's exempt from this rule. And the rule requires 3 stages of different levels of examination of secondary effects of the fuel, depending on how much of it you're putting into the market. So we don't want other pollutants that limit or deteriorate our air quality otherwise to be emitted due to these fossil fuels, and this regulation makes sure that that doesn't happen. On the light duty side, I did want to show this slide as well. This is one possible scenario of how we will reduce greenhouse gas emission from the light duty sector, and really To meet our national ambient air quality standards, I think there's a session earlier about the lower ozone standard, 70 ppb. To meet our goals for 80% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2080, we need a lot of zero-emission vehicles. And the best way to do that is through battery electric and hydrogen fuel cells. So those biofuels that will be available can be used in other things such as aviation or trucking or other things. I work in the research division, so I didn't want to give a talk without talking a little bit about research. We've spoken about our programs very broadly. We've all heard the saying that the devil is in the details, and there's a lot of little things that need to happen for this broad vision of a low carbon intensity transportation sector and economy broadly happens. There are many different trade-offs. For example, landfill gas right now is being combusted on site to generate electricity. Is that the best use of it? If you can generate electricity using solar or wind and you need the natural gas for combustion in a truck or something like that, what kind of infrastructure do you need in order to put renewable natural gas into the pipeline, and what kind of pipeline do you construct such that maybe later you can use the same pipeline to move hydrogen around? Next steps, we will certainly continue to decarbonize our economy and transportation. We need to maximize the use of biomass and optimize its use. So let's make sure we get to that optimistic scenario that I showed from that earlier study. And let's make sure that the biomass that we do convert to fuels are being used for fuels that are the most needed. Like I said, we will come out with a scoping plan update in 2016 that is going to lay out how to meet the very aggressive standards for 2030. You could make the argument that we don't need a low carbon fuel standard. You can just have all the fuels part of the cap and trade system, but we do expect that the low carbon fuel standard will continue to be part of the solution as we move past 2020, and we will continue to do the research that's needed to implement these programs. Thank you.